Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I wanted to introduce our next session. Our next session is Advancements in Manufacturing, GMP, and Global Supply Chain Strategies. And we have moderator Sean Werner, who is president of Sexton Biotechnologies. Joining him will be panelist John Balkunas, workforce director for the National Institute for Innovation in Manufacturing Biopharmaceuticals, Dan Bright, director of Manufacturing Operations at Cellectis, and John Tomtishen, Director of Manufacturing Technical Operations at Legend Biotech. Hello, everybody. Thank you and welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sean, and I think we'll just go ahead and get started here. Nicole did a nice job of running through everybody there. So I was just talking about advancements in manufacturing and trying to see what is still needed out there and what may already be working. So I'd like to start just, to the group. It'd be really good to hear what you think are the biggest ongoing challenges that manufacturing advancements can really help overcome in the industry. And do you think there are specific advancements that will really make a difference, or are there more broad advancements that will help kind of across the board on manufacturing? And by make a difference, a little bit about what's more important right now. Is it kind of a change in the cost of goods, better robustness, or something else entirely? Maybe start with Dan.
Sure. So to my mind, right, the question of where do we want to make a difference is really the important one. The cost of goods is obviously going to be a major factor for the success of any product down the line, right? So the closer you get to commercialization, the more you want to drive your cost of goods down. However, for me, at least, I feel like the ability to drive down your cost of goods kind of springs out of some of these other pieces of discussion, right? So for me, the most important piece, especially when you're in early or mid-stage biotech, right, when you've got early stage products, clinical trials that you have going on, process robustness is really going to be the major focus, or needs to be the major focus, right? The more thoroughly you understand your process, the better you're going to understand the data that comes out of your process, and the more effectively you're going to be able to implement different solutions, different changes, process improvements, manufacturing improvements as a whole, right, from a holistic point of view, to sort of drive that down that end point cost of goods. So for me, I think there are some product specific improvements that you can make, but I think there's a much larger piece of this, and it's about those more broadly applicable solutions, like you said, right? So it's about electronic systems to reduce your labor, to reduce your potential for deviations, but it's also about managing your labor pool and your workforce effectively, getting them trained properly, getting them in a position to really be truly successful when they're executing against your manufacturing processes.
John?
This is John. I can chime in. I think it's interesting you noted the workforce early on in this question, because I was kind of trying to figure out how I'd approach that one. But I think my expertise is more on the workforce side of things, and I think since you mentioned it, challenge obviously is that the process is still evolving, and therefore the needs of the workforce continue to evolve. And I think it's going to take time for the processes to standardize and become fixed enough to really know what the workforce is needed. And I think right now, I think what the standpoint is totally different than what we'll need 5 or 10 years down the road. And I think part of the problem for a lot of companies is just being able to forecast that need, because it's changing.
Yeah, I would just add on to what Dan echoed there too. I think one of the key things right now for the industry as a whole, right, is really focusing on that process robustness area, right? Because if you don't focus on that, you're not going to be able to scale up or scale out these therapies, and at that point, it doesn't even matter. Right? And you don't control that process and ensure that you can get a good quality product consistently out to the patients that need it. That COGS is really an afterthought at that point, right? So it's really focusing on how can you really ensure that we have process robustness across the industry, especially as you look into going to additional indications, right? And also around, right, and then playing into that, right, of looking at autologous and allogeneic, right? If you're looking at how do you scale out or scale up those different processes, how do you look at standardizing things across the industry, right? I mean, one example is potency assays, right? I mean, there's so many different ways that companies can look at that or interpret different regulations, right? And then also going into play with that is also how can we work? I know the different agencies are working on this, although with the pandemic going on, I know it's kind of on the back burner right now, but looking at ways, how can you standardize global regulations as well, right? With the FDA or the EMA in Europe or elsewhere around the globe as well. So I think I agree with Dan, right? Process robustness is really where it starts, and everything else kind of trickles down from there.
So that's two sort of main themes there come to mind for me, obviously, process robustness and workforce on that. And if you think about manufacturing as a concept and advancements in manufacturing, what elements of that really can help on that? Is it focusing on things like just better materials and products, or automation that fits across a different phases of development? What types of advancements are people really looking for?
Yeah, I think I'll start off, Sean. I think there's a couple different things, right? I think one point you mentioned there, right? I think one is ensuring your supply chain, right? Of making sure you're working with your collaborators or partners or external suppliers, right? Because at the end of the day, if you don't have the raw materials to meet the demand, even if you have that capacity in-house to manufacture, you really need to work with your suppliers to ensure that those they can meet what your expectations are. So it's working with them, and it's also working on I think process automation is key, but it's also thinking about, is there an easier way to do things, right? I mean, one key thing, automation is important, but at the end of the day, you don't want to over automate things though too, right? Because at the end of the day, if something's working well manually, there's really no need to automate it, right? So keep it as simple as possible, and really focus on, right, in the pharma industry or biotech industry as a whole, where can you bring in, say, operational best practices, right? So looking at poka-yoking things or looking at way to streamline communications and breaking down silos between different organizations as well, right? Because one of the key challenges, I think, is just because of the complexities, is how can you really ensure that teams in different functional areas are on the same page, right? And then that can also help streamline different processes as well.
Yeah, and just to build a little bit on the concept of automation within these processes, the fundamental truth of the matter is that while we do have a really good handle on how we need to go about making the products work for what we need them to work for, there's so much variability especially when you're in an autologous product, but even with an allogeneic product, right? There's so much variability in your incoming material. There's variability in the patients that you're treating. There's variability that crops up throughout the process. Automation is great, and automation is definitely going to be a key part of being able to scale up and scale out, to John's earlier point, right? But I think, to add to another point John mentioned there, right, there's always going to be a need for the human element. There's always going to be a need for effectively trained people with the right background, the right kind of degrees, right? Or in a lot of cases, not needing, just speaking to the degree piece of it, you don't necessarily need a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, or you certainly don't need a doctorate to be able to process in these rooms, right? There's such an element of art to the work that we do, right? The cells change and behavior from collection to collection. The end efficacy of the product, even if you've got a high potency product, it changes patient to patient because human biology is so different person to person. Indications behave differently, slightly, or to a larger extent, depending on the patient. So I think there's sort of a combination. Automation is definitely going to be a piece of this, but I've been involved in many conversations where you're talking about a potential process improvement where you're going to replace a manual part of the process with a more automated version of that using a larger piece of equipment or something like that. And the conversation revolves around, okay, well, we can achieve this level of performance in the manual version of this part of the process, and the automated version of the process becomes more repeatable. You take out the human element, but your level of performance, you're capped at a much lower level of output. So then you're starting to talk about, well, okay, is getting 70% of the result that I can on average achieve with a human being doing this part of the process, is that acceptable to me? And does that impact the efficacy of my product down the line?
Sounds a little bit like a risk benefit analysis on some of those things, right? And maybe the manufacturing changes are one element of it, but again, it ties directly into the training of the people and who you need to be able to operate in both worlds a little bit.
Yeah.
What about interactions? You know, if you think about how we as an industry move forward, and you know, from our side as a supplier, a lot of times we get partial or clouded messages from development groups in terms of what are our challenges, what are our problems, and sometimes they may be pretty unique, and yet, you know, as a supplier, you're trying to service the broader industry. But I think also probably the same thing happens on developers and maybe educational institutions or training institutes. And, you know, are there some new ways that we can interact on some of the stakeholder side of things and figure out how to communicate better?
Well, I think it's important to figure out what are the areas where collaboration is possible now. And I can, you know, saying that from Nimble's perspective, we're all about, you know, trying to drive collaboration and try and drive unique collaborations between, you know, industry and suppliers and academic institutions. And so, you know, I think it's about trying to figure out, sort of to add a, you know, an asterisk to your question, it's trying to figure out what are the areas where collaboration is possible. And I think in areas like cell therapy and gene therapy, it's the wild, wild west right now, and everybody's locked up on, you know, keeping pretty tight grip on what they're doing internally. And so it's trying to figure out where you can collaborate. And like, so one question that I'd ask, I hear a lot of talk that everybody's pretty much open to collaboration on, say, analytics and better analytics. There's less proprietary, you know, ground there. And so I'd be curious, you know, what are other areas where people are, you know, where collaboration is possible versus where it's just too competitive right now to allow it?
So I'll jump in right off on this because I was in a roundtable yesterday and another conference that was talking explicitly to collaboration in the age of COVID, right? So there's, to your point, analytical development, there's always some collaboration. There's always backroom collaboration between people in similar areas of industry with similar roles across different companies. But I think there's some more fundamental opportunities for collaboration, which is sharing strategically how we go about working through some of these macro challenges that everybody experiences, COVID being a perfect example, right? So one of the ways that we've been dealing with the new reality of not being able to go on site for things like FAT testing or training for different parts of processes is we're leveraging augmented reality glasses, the Microsoft HoloLens in particular, right? And when I brought that up on my last conversation about these sort of collaborative sharing concepts, that was something that didn't really spring to mind immediately for a lot of people. And it's, so there's those micro challenges that are more process specific, to your point, where people want to keep that very close to the vest. But then there are these larger challenges that affect everybody, where there's not really, you're not gaining a strategic benefit from hiding that you're using an AI program to track and trend your data, or an augmented reality system to allow you to get a first-person view from a technician who's performing an FAT for you when you can't send a delegation out to Switzerland or Germany or wherever else you might be doing work in. So I think there's more opportunity for collaboration than immediately meets the eye, essentially, outside of those very proprietary, very tightly held areas of the field.
Yeah, and just to add on to, I think Dan brought up a good point, right? Especially with the pandemic, right? Everyone has gone through this, right? And I think it's to some benefit, right? It's really thought or made us think about how can we really improve our collaboration, right? There's new business models, there's new ways of working, right? That was required to be successful, because at the end of the day, right, the patients that needed these therapies still needed them, right? So we still needed to manufacture the therapies and get them out to the patients. And it really took both from an internal perspective, but also working or thinking about a new model, working with externally or external suppliers or vendors or partners, right? Of how do you really overcome some of these challenges, right? And I think that's a key example of something that's, I think overall the industry has been pretty successful over the past year or so, right, of dealing with the pandemic, right? We're still treating patients, we're still getting these therapies out to those who need it. And also to add on to Dan's point, right, there's every company is really focusing on the main things, right? Back to the earlier discussion points, right? Of cost of goods, how can you scale out and scale up, right? So it's how can we look at that macro view to what Dan suggested and really navigate around and look at ways to improve the industry as a whole.
And then maybe shifting a little bit to the other side of things, what have you seen in the last couple of years that seems to have been working in terms of manufacturing advancements and systems or processing changes? What would you suggest to a company that's just now thinking about tech transfer, setting up their manufacturing systems for scale up and commercial path? And kind of related to that, is there a correlation between how you think about your manufacturing strategy and what your end commercial strategy is for your product?
Yeah, I'll start off, Sean. I think a key for any company is to really begin and think about what is your end goal, right? What is your long-term strategy? Because that'll be so critical in how you navigate the space, right? If you really want to focus on getting to the commercial market or arena, right, and having multiple therapies on the commercial market, or do you want to say get it to a certain stage and then partner with a different organization, right? So for an example, academic institutions, right, they're not going to take products to the commercial market, right? They're going to look to partner with someone. So it's really understanding what is your end goal, and that'll play a key role in how you develop and define that strategy, right? Whether you're looking at a partner, whether you're looking at working with a CMO or CDMO, a CRO, that'll be key to really defining that overall strategy.
Agreed. John hit the nail on the head there, right? You have to take the long-term view. And I've been involved, right, with some of my past work at CDMOs. I've been involved with clients that, right, you've got varying levels of funding, you've got varying backgrounds for the processes. To John's point, a lot of them come out of academia, right? So for me, the most critical thing is looking forward to the goal for every therapy that's out there on the market is to go commercial, right? Because that's how we treat as many patients as humanly possible. So the earlier you start to get that long-term view in mind and start to really refine the process and make it commercially viable. There's certain things you don't have to do until later in the development process, admittedly, right? But there are certain things like getting the right materials at the right level, getting human use materials, especially for critical materials that you're going to be using in your process, in as early as possible. You can use research use only materials for phase 1 trials, right? Or for early development work, at least. But when it comes time to start filing for later phases of your process, you're going to get shut down. And there's going to be a really long path to finding the right supplier, getting the right partnership in place, getting the right level of quality out of that raw material that you need to make your final product, whether that's vector or some sort of critical reagent or whatever else. But using that as the example, the earlier you start thinking about commercialization and your BLA and everything else, right, that it may cost a little more on the upfront, which is a difficult conversation to have at times with the higher ups at any given company. But when people really have that mature, forward-thinking mindset, right, and they look out to say, look, in 3 years and 5 years, I want to have 2 commercial products. I want to have 3 commercial products. They see very quickly that the cost of doing this scales up. Right, getting these longer term views in place reduces your overall cost in the long term.
Dan, it's interesting you mentioned the academic groups might not be thinking about it in the same way, and John, it makes me wonder: is there a way to sort of, or is there a benefit even in interacting in some of the training centers around to sort of get some of those people who are maybe in their postdoc program working on a translational GMP early phase work to actually start thinking about how would you transfer that? Is that something that would help along in the process?
I think so. And again, I'm not a technical expert at all, but everything that I hear and everything that I see both on the cell and gene therapy side, I think where there's a paradigm shift compared to say MABs and other areas within sort of traditional biologics is, at that tech transfer point, it's that proverbial hand over the fence to manufacturing and they go and do it. I think when you're looking at cell and gene and a lot of these products that are being developed in academic labs, they're being handed over the fence without much thought to, to how that's going to scale up and how it's going to, be manufactured at all. And so they're handing it over to more scientists, more bench people, more process development people that are having to go back and reinvent the wheel and start from ground zero. And I think, I'm already seeing, so I work with Nimble leading their workforce efforts, but I also work at NC State and North Carolina overseeing a training program. And we hear from clients a lot about the need for folks working in research in cell and gene therapy to better understand manufacturing process and what is scalable in the first place. And so that from a development standpoint, they're approaching their development in the right way. And so they're developing, something that can be scaled, period.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely an opportunity.
And to go hand in hand with that, right? A lot of times you see, because everything, especially with smaller biotech, everything is about promises you're making to your investors, right? So when you think you've got a product that is coming out of a research lab, coming out of an academic institution, you've got a process that works fine, right, under LP conditions and expectations, and they tell their investors that, hey, we can get this, we can get our first, they engage with the CMO, they say, we think we can get our first clinical product out to the clinics in 10 months, right? And then they come in the door to that CMO, and it turns out that in reality, their flow assays are underdeveloped. Their raw material pipeline is not what it needs to be. That 10-month runway very rapidly becomes 12 months, 14 months, right? Or that 8-month runway turns into a year, and then the cost scales accordingly, right? So now they're in the position of having to turn back around and say, hey, well, the process works in a lab, but in order to meet regulatory expectations, we now have to redevelop this whole assay. We can't just transfer the assay and do some comparability work because it's not as robust and repeatable as we needed it to be, or we're missing this crucial raw material that we now have to go and get an appropriate grade, which means a new partnership with a brand new supplier from scratch. And these things can be devastating for programs.
And one thing to add on to that, I think really key there in that messaging, right, is really to have your early stage development teams and your late stage development teams partner and work together, right, and ensure that there's that clear line of communication. So whatever the early stage teams, obviously I think that's where a lot of the innovation occurs, but then making sure that you have that later stage MST teams working closely with them to ensure that what they're developing can actually be scalable in the future as well.
Yeah, everything works on paper, right?
And that's a really interesting comment. I know from some personal experience that even in very large pharma companies, sometimes working close enough together from PD to throwing it over into real product development from late phase research is a major gap. It's sort of everybody's priorities are very different. How do you get that to work better, or is it easier to do in a small setting? I wonder.
So I think
that's.
Well, go ahead, John. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a challenge with every company. How do you really form those good lines of communication? I think one of the key things is really ensuring that everyone has that shared success and has that same end goal, right? Of understanding, okay, where do we need to get to, and what are those transition points, and clearly map out the stage gates or handovers within your process. But I do think that is a challenge, right? But you really need to focus on how do you get everyone on the same page, right? And get everyone invested on the same goal, right? Because if you have different priorities, to your point, Sean, right? Different groups have different priorities and are focusing on different things. But how can you really have that alignment across those different groups, right? So they have that shared goal or shared and target to overcome some of those challenges.
And so just to piggyback on that, right? That's addressing the elements of siloing that you see in so many businesses is really the first line of defense there, right? Or the first line of attack, I guess, would be a better way of putting it. To your point, Sean, and to John's point, everybody has their own priorities within their department. And when you don't get those really open lines of communication between people, and you don't have that open knowledge flow, you're removing those opportunities for learning at those different stages, right? And there's always opportunities for cross-pollination of ideas between different departments in any organization, or between an external an external a group that's developing a process in an academic institution, and then the company that's investing in it and financing it who wants to take it to another third external manufacturer, right? The earlier you get people engaged and talking about what they really need and what works for them across all those different groups, the better off you're going to be.
We're moving right along on time here. A few minutes more. I wanted to kind of rethink a little bit about going back to the workforce concept. And, you know, obviously there's on the supply side of the workforce, appropriate training and talent pool and everything. But on the manufacturing side, are there elements of thinking through the manufacturing process or tools that help you sort of foolproof the process so that you can make sure you have successful employees when they come in the door and simplify training?
So
go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
No, go ahead. I've got it's tangentially related, so I'll let you take it.
Sure. So I think for me, it all comes down to training, right? So you need to have the mantra that I've kind of lived by is right person, right role, right? So the first thing you want to start with is making sure you've got the right people, the right backgrounds for what you're doing. It's not going for people who are going to, bringing in a workforce that's going to be very quickly bored by the work that you're having them do. But then when you get them in the door, it's about getting them to be as effective as possible, as quickly as possible. So you really need to look at your process and then look at your training methodology and break down how you're going to educate your team, whatever the composition of background may be, to work on getting them as effective as possible, as quickly as possible. So it's door to floor, right? How quickly can I get that person in and bringing benefit to the team and being part of the production process? And that to me is about streamlining your training, right? So streamlining your onboarding and then streamlining the way that you not only train people on the individual operations of your process, but also how you sign them off, right? Because you can really, I don't know what the right word here is, but you can really damage your ability to get people out there and producing if you sort of restrict how you train and how you authorize them to be able to perform.
And we have two questions.
And I think you hit
John, and I think if I can ask one of them, point to you actually about workforces, talking about how to address the specific challenges of the limitations of qualified people in the workforce. So, it's difficult to find people. Do you have any suggestions for how everyone can approach that?
I mean, I think it's all about establishing relationships with sources of talent. And I think it's being open to what those sources of talent are. And specifically within cell therapy, I think it's an interesting conversation right now, because I've talked to a number of, companies in the cell therapy space that, very rightly so. And to be concrete about examples, and down in the weeds to some extent, they're looking for almost exclusively BS degree graduates to go run go do manufacturing and basically sit and do manual manipulations under a hood all day. And, in terms of, trying to prove, keep your process in a way that's not going to be damaged by that, I think it's a problem, because, BS degree students and graduates, they get bored quick doing that work, and they're looking for their next opportunity. They're looking for their next jump. And when that's all they're doing all day, I think it's a challenge. And I think there's been some good conversation with a number of the companies recently about, opening your eyes to, say, community college graduates. And, community colleges have been training people in biotech and biomanufacturing for years. And the skills by and large are the same as they are for, in cell therapy and gene therapy and a lot of these different industries. And I'd probably honestly argue that there's a lot of community college, 2-year degree graduates that graduate with a lot more experience pipetting and doing manual manipulation than any BS graduate, and are content and happy doing that work. And so I think, when it comes down to looking at how to find, adequate supply, I think that supply is out there. I'm not saying it's not a problem, because I think as the industry continues to take off, it will be a problem. But I think there are a lot of partnerships out there that are not being formed yet that could.
So maybe it's looking for the wrong talent at some level and maybe rethink what your needs are, possibly.
Yeah, well, exactly. I think that is, it is, yeah.
Yeah, just to add on what John mentioned there, I think he had a couple of good points, right? And I think the other thing to think about when you think about your workforce strategy is that it should be a dynamic, evolving situation too, right? As your company or processes mature, what you thought you needed initially, it shouldn't be the same as you get to become a more mature organization, right? So, for example, one of the things that you could look at when you're first starting out your staffing, right? Instead of hiring, say, scientists and say within your development organization and then operators as well, could you look at a hybrid approach, right? Depending on volumes and scales and things like that, where you hire individuals in that scientist role, but then they're also operating to some extent as well. And then you can, as your organization continues to evolve, right, you can maybe have some of those individuals go directly in just that development role, or you can have them stay within operations. I think the other point that John brought up then too, right, is right. I think there is a standard profile that the industry is really looking for, but I think we really need to think about is that what we really need, right? I think one of the key areas is maybe you need some individuals with a BS degree, but you really need to diversify that workforce, right? You want to have individuals that can grow within that role, but then obviously I think you need to have others that maybe this is an entry point for them and they're looking for something else, but you really need to have that diverse background of individuals within the role.
Yes,
yeah, so very much.
Question on here. Sorry, this moving a little bit too fast. But can you talk a little bit about the main differences, disadvantages, and advantages between an allo and an auto product? So I don't know, Dan and John, maybe you can speak a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So advantages and disadvantages. I think there's a question of advantages to the manufacturing group, or is it advantages to the patient population, right? And I think for the manufacturing side of things, the big advantage of an allo is that it's not a one-to-one, right? So my costs are lower overall, right? Because I can produce many more treatments for many more patients with the same single process. And I can stockpile, right? So I can run a number of back-to-back runs and then have enough material to support a clinical trial for months at that point. Whereas with an autologous product, right, we're going vein to vein, essentially. We're going patient back to patient. That being said, there's also the other side of the question, which is advantage to patients. And I think that's a much longer term question, because it really remains to be seen where allo and where auto are truly going to fit together, right? Because future state, 5-7 years down the line, there's going to be sort of niches that I think get carved out depending on patient population, depending on indication or genetic disease, where you're going to see allos being more effective for a large part of the population, and autos may be effective for those who don't respond well to the allos. But then there's going to be indications where you may just not be able to get an allogeneic product to work, right? So it's an interesting question, and it kind of goes in multiple directions, I think.
Yeah, and just to add on what Dan mentioned, right? I think the key thing to that, right, is, I mean, the differences between auto and allo, right? And there's pros and cons to both. I think the key thing though is really understanding what does your product portfolio look like, and understanding what is that patient population for that disease, right? So if in the long term, from an industry perspective, I see auto and allo running hand in hand, right? Maybe for ultra rare or rare indications, right? When you don't have a larger population, maybe autologous is the way to go. If you have a larger population, right? If you think about solid tumors, maybe it makes sense to look at it from an allo perspective. But I think it boils down to what is the specific target patient population that you're looking at, right? And that'll ultimately decide on where is the right way to go, right? Whether it's the autologous platform or allogeneic platform.
Great. I don't know, Nicole, I think that's the end of our time, but I don't know if we can keep going or how this is running.
Yeah, so no problem. Yeah, so we have 10 more minutes. It's going to 1:45, including the Q&A session. So
Okay,
I would
great.
invite the audience to keep questions or comments, anything you want to engage with the speakers right now. And if you guys want to keep going as well, I can send those through as they come.
Sure.
Great.
And John, I wanted to touch on, you made a comment that I thought was really interesting about, from a workforce perspective, looking at how to essentially give, say that existing workforce, if it is mostly BS folks, giving them a different roles and different aspects to what they're doing, so they're not just manufacturing all day and that they're doing different things. I think that's a valuable approach, and I think it's a noteworthy point, obviously, because you've got to keep these folks motivated, and especially if you're training them up to do manufacturing. And so giving them, a diverse role, I think is something that makes sense.
And I think it's really thinking about, right, what stage are you at as an organization, right, of focusing on that, right? Because at certain stages it makes sense, I think, where you can give those opportunities, and I think that's really what's needed at that point, right? So you can essentially kill two birds with one stone, right? Where you still have that production capability, but then they're also focusing on that development, right? So they're learning that process, but then they're also translating that to an actual operations setting, right? Of scaling out. How do you ensure that what you're developing actually works as well?
Well, and it's interesting. I just remembered the other half of the point that I wanted to make in commenting on that one, and that's, the other half of the reality right now, of course, is cell and gene therapy that's where everybody wants to go that's working in the workforce already. And so you've got all these people that are working in, traditional biologics that are migrating over to the cell and gene companies because it's exciting, because it's, curative therapy, because it's a totally new thing to do. And I think that approach is going to be critical to keeping those folks motivated, especially if they're coming over to do roles that are more focused around manufacturing. And so I think it's interesting.
It's another question from the audience. What areas should pharma oncology manufacturers invest in-house versus leveraging partnerships or outsourced?
Yeah, so I'll start off with this one. I think at the end of the day, I think again begins with what is your long-term goal as an organization, and really understanding what your patient population is, right? If you have a smaller indication, right, or a smaller product portfolio or things like that, maybe it makes sense, right, to partner with CMOs versus bringing something in-house, right? Because at the end of the day, building a fully scalable GMP facility isn't cheap, and it takes a lot of capital. So really understanding mapping out from a financial perspective from your company, what are really the trade-offs and where's that tipping point, right? I mean, you could look at even a bridging strategy, something like that for your programs, right? Maybe you start off with a CMO and bring them in-house at a later point. Maybe you go directly in-house. It ultimately depends on a couple of different factors, right? Both from a technical perspective as well as what is the overall viability of your business, right? And where you're at on that journey as an organization.
Yeah,
agreed. Are there enough peripheral sort of organizations? You talk about CMOs, and presumably that's biopsy to finish, right? But what about, are there enough outsourced, say, QC lab testing or other functions that you might be able to tack onto your manufacturing instead of doing it all in the lab, in the office?
So I think that goes back to John's point about business strategy, right? So depending on what your long-term strategy is as a company, if you're planning on staying with external CMOs for your manufacturing for the foreseeable future, right? If building your own in-source manufacturing capabilities isn't even a conversation today, or it's not on your horizon, then I think you're going to want to look at maybe developing your analytical side, right? Because it takes a lot less space to run an analytical lab than it does to run a manufacturing facility that can meet a commercial need right down the line. So I think building insourcing versus outsourcing, right? The big driver has to be your business strategy. And even if your goal is to build in-house manufacturing capability down the line, then while you're on the way to that milestone, right? Because that's a big step for a company to take. And I think it's a very important step for certain companies to take, but it's just not viable for everybody depending on your funding and the potential for your indication and your investors. There's a lot of people to convince when it comes to taking that kind of leap. You really have to evaluate where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. And for me, that insourcing analytical testing, in using external testing labs, everything can get done for a fee, right? but you may not get your data as quickly as you want to get it. You may not get as much information as you would like to get. So to me, if you're not going to be insourcing your manufacturing capability, I would focus on analytical testing, sterility testing, things like that, where you can guarantee, right, your critical assays for your product, where you can guarantee release for that product and that you have control over that piece of the process as much as possible.
We had a few new questions come in, Sean. I know we're running close on time, but I'd love to get to them if we can.
Yep.
I think the most recent was the academic.
Yeah, so the question, which do you think is better positioned to evaluate and implement new innovative technologies or strategies, academic or commercial developers?
So for me, it's about point of use. I think if you really want to evaluate a new and innovative technology, you want to see how many different applications you have for it, how robust is it, how repeatable is it. You should go and find a CMO and try to partner with them to see how many different, because the CMO is going to have access to all these different processes, different cell types, different cell lines, different execution styles and backgrounds. So that's where you're really going to get the most exposure for your equipment, right? Academic or commercial developers, they come up with the equipment and they can test it out in their site and their facilities, but it's really about how it performs in the real world at the end of the day, not in a controlled environment.
Great. And then the next one here is, you talked about interconnectedness of manufacturing with research and figuring out what is viable from a manufacturing perspective. How do you design in that interconnected organization, and how would it look different from the way a lot of organizations are today?
Yeah, I think the key thing to that, right, is really having that aligned goals and strategy, right? Making sure that everyone's really being measured against the same end results, right? If you have everyone being measured on the same metrics, right, then you're gonna force that alignment to get that, right? But once you start having different metrics for different organizations, that's where you can kind of get that divergence, right? And you have that differences in priority between, say, research or late stage development, right? So it's really forcing that everyone's being measured against the same metrics as a way to really start to think about driving that collaboration.
You know, one thing to add to that is there's the metric side of it, which is absolutely critical. There's also the social side of it, which I think we missed the ball on a lot, or in many cases, right? Building relationships. Relationships are key to everything in everything we do in our lives, right? But most especially in business. So setting up, I've been on teams where, manufacturing and development never talk. There's nothing more than emails, or they only come in contact with each other in meetings when there's explicit deliverables to be discussed, or there's an emergency and we need to solve a problem. And that can cause a lot of issues and a lot of disconnectedness, right? So one of the things that I was actually talking with a colleague from another biotech company just a couple of days ago, and one of the things that they've implemented is they call it coffee with a stranger, right? And they sort of find times to link people up to just have the opportunity to get to know each other outside of a business conversation, because when you can put a face to a name, right? I've heard it time and time again where somebody in the clean room is annoyed because environmental monitoring isn't getting in here and doing my reads, and I want to go home. Well, it's not environmental monitoring, the faceless, nameless, group. It's a human being on the other end of that. And when they know, oh, it's Jeff, oh, it's Dan, it's Sean, and it's been a long day and he just got held up somewhere, right? Like building those relationships of making somebody human, right? Allows for a much freer flow of ideas and discussion.
And I would agree with Dan on that, right? I mean, I think it's really establishing those open communications, right? It's whether, even if you have a group meeting or something, right? Invite different members from other teams, right? And your team can get to know them. And I think it's really critical, back to our early discussion, right? Under the pandemic, where you don't really see everyone on a regular basis. So it's even more critical now than it was before.
Yeah.
John Balkin, from the people perspective, anything to add to those thoughts?
If not, I think we have one more. We can just fit it in. We're on seconds now, but
Yep. So
Yep.
the last question we have here is about what kind of ERP strategy should be in place to guarantee robust end-to-end manufacturing?
Yeah, so from an ERP strategy perspective, I think there's a lot of different things to consider within that, right? So it's thinking about, okay, what is your long-term goal, right? When you think about an ERP system, right? I mean, it's really what drives your business. It really enables you to at the end of the day, to sell your products or receive materials and things like that. So it's something that really needs a lot of thought and consideration needs to go into that, right? Because it touches so many different processes within your organization, really every functional group, right, within your team, right, beyond just manufacturing, right, commercial, clinical, every team within your organization, right, has a huge role or a large impact on your overall organization.
Yeah,
Guys, we are at time.
Interconnectivity is critical.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Good.
Well, I would say there was no end of interest in this session, so we really came right up against it. Thank you guys so much. I hope you'll join the platform and perhaps people will reach out with more questions there. Thank you guys.
Thanks all.
Thank you.